Welcome everybody to another Math Amazing video. Today we will be solving quadratics by the quadratic formula. Before we start, just a couple things I want to go over. Well, first of all, what exactly is the quadratic formula? And the quadratic formula is just this. When solving for x with quadratics, x is going to equal negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Okay, that is the quadratic formula. And instead of factoring or completing the square or something like that, sometimes we want to use the quadratic formula, or we have to use the quadratic formula in order to solve for x. Another thing we have to be sure is we have to know what standard form is, because on all of these problems, if we cannot get it into standard form, then it's going to be hard to tell, what b or what a, b, and c actually are. So standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now, this is what we want to start every problem with. Okay, so our problem has to start in standard form in order to use the quadratic formula. And the last piece of information that we need to know is this part underneath the square root. That is going to be called the discriminant. What does this information actually tell you? Well, sometimes we're going to use it to determine how many roots we have, or even if we can have real solutions or not. You're not necessarily required to find out what the discriminant actually is, but it'll actually give you a better idea of what you're looking for. So in the case in which b squared minus 4ac, when that is greater than 0, when this value underneath the square root is greater than 0, we're going to have two real different roots. And by real, I mean real numbers. If b squared minus 4ac is equal to 0, then we're going to have one root, well, what we call a double root. There's two roots, but it's one actual root twice. And then the last one, if b squared, or the last choice, I guess, if it is less than 0, then we have no real solution. Now, for these particular problems, or my examples that I'm going to do today, I'm going to want to use problems in which there is an actual solution. So just keep this in mind, though. When we have a discriminant that is a negative value, if you have a negative, this is when there's negatives. Under the square root. If there is a negative value underneath that square root, there's going to be no real solution. Okay, so those are just a couple things to keep in mind before we start. There's not too many steps when it comes to solving quadratics using the quadratic formula. Basically, get it into standard form and then use the quadratic formula to solve for x. So question number 1, or example number 1. (2x squared equals 1 minus 2x). So we always want to start into standard form. Okay, we always want it to look like ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So we need it to look like this. So we have to move the 2x, we have to move the 1, both of those over to the other side. So in order to do that, we're going to add our 2x, and then the next one, we want the 1 over there. We're going to subtract our 1 from both sides. 2x squared plus 2x minus 1 equals 0. So now we have our A, now we have our B, and now we have our C. And we can move over to step 2, which is just plugging them into the actual quadratic formula. So the quadratic formula says negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And it's just substitution. Wherever we see a b, we're going to substitute 2. Wherever we see a c, we're going to substitute negative 1. Wherever we see an a, we're going to substitute positive 2. So negative b is positive 2, so negative 2 plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 2 squared, minus 4 times a is 2, and c is negative 1. All divided by 2 times our a, which is 2, and then just simplify. So let's simplify this. We have negative 2 plus or minus, underneath the square root, 2 squared, which is 4. 4 times 2, which is 8, times negative 1, which is negative 8. So minus a negative 8, which is positive 8. All divided by 2 times 2, which is 4. Simplify even further. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 12, all divided by 4. And simplifying the square root of 12. Let's do this in a different color. Square root of 12, if we were to simplify this, that is the same thing as saying the square root of 4 times 3. And the square root of 4 is 2, so we can pull out the 2 root 3. So our answer simplified, negative 2 plus or minus 2 root 3 all divided by 4. And we could simplify this even further by reducing, dividing everything by our common factor, which is our 2. So negative 1 plus or minus root 3 divided by 2. And how do we write that as an actual solution set? Minus 1 minus root 3 over 2, and minus 1 plus root 3 divided by 2. And that is example number 1. Example number 2. We're going to have 2x divided by x minus 3 plus 1 over x equals 4. And again, even though this does not maybe from appearances look like a quadratic, in order to use the quadratic formula, the first thing we have to do is get it into standard form. And in order to get it into standard form, we have to get rid of these fractions. And to get rid of fractions, just like with linear equations, we're going to want to multiply the entire equation by the least common multiple. So what's the least common multiple in the denominators? We have an x minus 3 here, and we have an x here. So the least common multiple in the denominators is just the product of those two. So we want to multiply the entire equation by x times x minus 3. Okay, and I'll still write the original equation in red. And simplifying this, so for our first one right here, we have an x minus 3 on top, x minus 3 on the bottom. So those two are gonna cancel, and we're left with 2x times our x, which is still left out here, plus, now on the second one, we have the x's that are gonna cancel, x on top, x in the denominator. So we have a 1 times x minus 3. And on the right side of the equation, we don't have a fraction, so we're just going to multiply everything. 4 times this x times x minus 3. So 4 times x minus 3. Now we just need to simplify. 2x times x, 2x squared. Here we're just going to distribute that 1. So we'll have x minus 3. And on the right side we have a 4x on the outside. Well, 4 times x is just 4x. So 4x, we go on to distribute that to each one on the inside. 4x squared minus 12x. Now we start to see that this is going to become a quadratic. So now with a quadratic, we want all of the terms on one side of the equation and then a 0 on the other side. It doesn't make a difference which one you move. You can move the 4 over to the other side, but me personally, I would want to move the lower value just so the first term, the a, can be positive. So I'm going to want to move all of this over to the other side just so we can have a positive a on this side. So we'll subtract the 2x squared. And like I said, it doesn't matter which way you do it. Just whatever you feel more comfortable with. You can move the right side to the left or the left side to the right. Those will cancel, and we're left with x minus 3 on that side, 4 minus 2, which is 2x squared minus 12x. And then now we're going to subtract an x. Just be careful when you do these. You don't want to subtract this x from the x squared. Remember, it has to be the same exponent in order for you to subtract them. So minus 3 equals 2x squared. Negative 12 minus 1 minus 13x. And then our last one, we have our minus 3 here, so we're going to add 3 to both sides. And now we're left with 2x squared minus 13x plus 3 equals 0. So now we have everything on one side of the equation. So what does that tell us? Well, just writing it back over on this side. What that tells us is that the 2 is the A, negative 13 is the B, and 3 is the C. So now we can plug it into the quadratic formula. Remember, quadratic formula is x equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So now we just have to substitute these values in for the quadratic formula. A negative 13. So remember, that's negative. Got to be careful on your signs here. Plus or minus the square root of negative 13 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 3, all divided by 2 times 2. Now let's simplify this. A negative and a negative will make a positive, so we have a positive 13 on the outside, plus or minus square root negative 13 squared 169 minus 4 times 2, which is 8, 8 times 3, which is 24. All divided by 4. And now underneath the square root, 13 plus or minus the square root of 145, all divided by 4. So what's our solution set? We'll have 13 minus the square root of 145 divided by 4, and 13 plus the square root of 145 divided by 4. Now you might ask, is the 145, can we reduce that 145, or the square root of 145, I should say? Well, in order to tell whether or not you can reduce that square root of 145, just break it down. The square root of 145, we know that 5 will divide into this evenly. So that is the same thing as 29 times 5. And can we break down 29? No, we cannot. 29 is a prime number. So 145 is, that's in reduced form. So we cannot do anything with this square root of 145. So our 2, x is going to equal our 13 minus the square root of 145 over 4, and 13 plus the square root of 145 over 4. So that's going to do it for today. Hope you learned something. If you please drop a like on the video. If you are not subscribed, please subscribe, and y'all have a good night. Bye.